Roman and Hims, which are now worth $5 billion and $4.5 billion respectively, have grown extremely quickly over the last few years. And we actually share in a lot of investors with Roman, who basically saw in us what they had seen in Roman at the same time. And so FirstMark Capital, which led our Series A, joined our board. That same person at FirstMark, Rick Heitzman, led the Series A of Roman and joined their board. So clearly there's a lot of kind of adjacencies between our spaces. Our goal as Legacy is to be the trusted source for all things fertility.
My name is Kevin David, and if you want real financial freedom for yourselves and for your loved ones today, then the time is now. And I will be there to help you every step of the way. What is up, guys, and welcome back to another exciting episode of your favorite or soon-to-be favorite podcast, The Kevin David Experience. Thanks to everybody who's been watching on YouTube, leaving comments, leaving reviews on iTunes, sharing the podcast, even with just one friend really does make a huge difference. So today we have a very special guest, Khaled Kteily, who challenged me to say his name correctly, and I think I actually got it. Did I get it?
You nailed it.
Nice. So the first question that we ask everybody on the podcast is to describe your entrepreneurial journey all the way up until right now in 60 seconds or less.
Yeah. All right, let's do this. Didn't think I was going to grow up starting a male fertility company. I had a medical accident about 6 years ago, which required me to test and freeze my sperm to make sure that everything was still working. It was. That experience was so mind-blowingly awkward, painful, and expensive that I realized there had to be a better way. Started researching the industry, became known as the Sperm King among my circle of friends. It is a crown I do not accept lightly. Major studies came out showing that sperm counts were massively on the decline, 50 to 60% over the last 40 years. Realized that was the time to launch the company. So quit my well-paying job. I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, working at the World Economic Forum, hobnobbing with all kinds of people. Sat my boss down, told him I was leaving to start my male fertility company. And that's what I did.
Nice.
Moved to Boston, started the company out of Harvard's Innovation Labs. We went through Y Combinator last summer, actually the summer before that. We've raised a little over $50 million in funding. We have a few celebrities who've invested. We now have a pretty sizable team of folks who are specialists in healthcare and fertility. So there we are. I think that was just under 60 seconds.
Nice. I love it. That was so well done, articulate, and you're also the first person I've ever heard use the word hobnobbing. Can you give a definition for the people listening on that one?
Yeah, schmoozing, just vibing with the folks who are attending the World Economic Forum or Davos.
Nice. I like that. So you said that sperm counts are decreasing by 50%. Why is that? Is it because everyone holds a cell phone in their pocket right next to the boys?
This is one of my conspiracy theories, but I have to be clear that it is a conspiracy theory. I do genuinely believe that in a couple of decades, having our phones in our pockets will be equivalent to what it was like smoking when we all thought smoking was okay for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
The reasons that I'm more confident saying are actually the rise of chemicals and phthalates, these types of endocrine disruptors that are around us. It's everything in the paint on your walls to the fertilizers that goes into the food that you eat. All of these are chemicals that are just extremely bad for you and can stay in your body for a long time. And actually, theories are that it can even make your penis size smaller over time, exposure to these chemicals.
Oh man. So for all the guys listening, how do you avoid that?
Yeah. I used to tease some of my friends who are kind of very much the hippy dippy, organic everything, and now I am all that and more.
Yeah.
I only shop chemical free, fragrance free, Whole Foods all the time. I strongly recommend doing the same.
Yeah, and so for people, because I've heard people say that before. I do the same thing, but then people are like, "Oh, well, it's so expensive to eat healthily." What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I would say it's more expensive to live unhealthy. It's more expensive to end up in the ER. It's more expensive to go to the hospital. It's more expensive to find out that you can't have kids in the future. So I would rather make the investment today and save money in the long term.
Yeah, so I mean, something that I've always wondered, first of all, the Sperm King, I love that. That's probably my favorite nickname I've ever heard for one of my guests. I think, actually, I was called that before. I'm just kidding, for a different reason, though.
My friends are partners.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I have, and this is kind of a strange question, but I'm just genuinely curious about it, is, you hear about couples who are actively trying to get pregnant, not on birth control, and they can't. And then you hear about random one night stands that result in a pregnancy. Like, what's the discrepancy there? Like, what, if people are actively trying to do it over and over and over again, on the ovulation cycle, all of that, and versus people that just randomly happen to have one night together and get pregnant.
Yeah. Kevin, you're asking a great question, actually. And the reality is we've all been taught in our late teens and early 20s that we have to be terrified of having unprotected sex or having an accident because that will lead to a child. The reality is, for a lot of couples, especially couples today who are more likely to be trying to have kids in their 30s than a few generations ago, right? When couples were trying to have kids in their 20s. And so you take a heterosexual couple, you're talking about a man who's less fertile, a woman who's less fertile, and that's just going to make it more and more difficult to conceive naturally. And in fact, about 40% of couples need 6 months or more of actively trying in order to be able to have kids if they're in their 30s. And the rest is frankly, it's just a numbers game. There is there's a fertile window for the female partner. Even male sperm production varies naturally over the course of what is effectively a male's menstrual cycle, but for sperm. And so if the stars align, sperm production is high, the woman is fertile, you have an accident, you absolutely can get pregnant with just one accident.
Yeah.
But that's just a numbers game.
So, for all the guys out there, and this is just theoretical, right? But, who use the pull-out method, right?
Yeah.
Does that work? Does that not work? Like, expel the myths for the guys watching.
Sure. So I have to be careful. I have to disclaim that I'm not here to give any medical advice.
Of course.
But I will say the pull-out method, if done correctly, has actually been shown to be quite effective. If you pair that with other forms of birth control, that can be quite effective.
Right.
For us as Legacy, and what we do is we focus on men who are not ready to have kids just yet. And so they're thinking about all different types of birth control, one of which is just freezing their sperm today to be able to use in the future, knowing that they have young and healthy sperm that's frozen.
Right. So I've heard about. So I used to work as a consultant at Facebook, and I remember hearing that there was like an option for women to like freeze their eggs as part of the like employee perks or whatever it was. But I either never heard about it for men or it didn't exist for men. Like, is that a common thing? I mean, I'm sure that that's not common for like most companies because they couldn't afford something like that. But like, how common is freezing your eggs, freezing your sperm for corporate companies, and is it even possible for men, or do they offer it?
I love this question. I'll tell you why. Up until I believe 2011, egg freezing was still considered experimental by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, the ASRM. It has only been over the past decade that this whole concept of sperm freezing has been normalized. So if you talk to a woman 10 years ago, she would not necessarily have even thought to freeze her eggs. And now it's something that women in your social circles and my social circles are probably thinking about or doing or pursuing. And it is for this reason that employers are covering what is a fairly expensive procedure. I mean, you're talking about $10,000 or more, as well as a procedure that requires 10 or 14 days of hormone injections, a surgical extraction under anesthesia for the women to get their eggs taken out before they're frozen. And so, employers are responding to demand from women who want to freeze their eggs to preserve their optionality. You compare that to sperm freezing, which employers are now starting to cover, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But you compare the process. With our kit, a man has to order a kit online. We ship it to him. He gets it the next day. He masturbates at home. That's all he has to do, however he wants to, whenever he wants to. He pushes a button on our website. We come and we pick it up. We ship it to our lab. We test it. We freeze it. And so our price point is under $200. And so you compare that $10,000 to freeze your eggs, weeks of hormone injection, surgical extraction, anesthesia, versus masturbating at home and paying less than $200, right? So when you see, I mean, the reality is, unfortunately, even biology is a little bit unfair to women because the process is so much easier for men.
Yeah.
But in part for this reason, actually, women and men have been the ones saying, hey, the burden of fertility gets talked about and put very much on the female partner. Why are we talking about guys? Guys are half the equation, right? An egg and ultimately a baby is made with, an embryo and ultimately a baby is made with a sperm and an egg. And so actually we have all kinds of partnerships with employers now. If you work at Snapchat, if you work at Box, if you work at Salesforce, your services are actually covered. The legacy services are actually covered and paid for by your employer.
Yeah. So, and that's really interesting. Because, we were talking about it the other day randomly that like the onus is like 100% on women to like get birth control, for example. This is a naive question, but does male birth control even exist? And if it does, do you honestly think that men as a whole in society in the USA will adopt it?
Yeah. Oof, we're wading into some very sensitive territory here. I think, I think in general, when you look back at medical history has been profoundly focused on the male to the exclusion of the female. There is so little research on anything to do with kind of female health, female hormones, female sexuality. It's focused very much on the guy, the research.
Yeah.
And then you end up with the burden very much being placed on the woman to take birth control and take all these other steps to make sure that she doesn't get pregnant.
Yeah.
And so, I think that that's starting to change. I can't speak to exactly the odds of there being a male contraceptive anytime soon, but I will say we have a research team. We recently brought on a head of research who used to work at a company called Ohana Biosciences that was explicitly trying to find a contraceptive for male.
Yeah.
They weren't able to, but there are a number of companies that are out there trying to do it. The better question is, would men actually take the contraceptive if it involved any sort of downside to them?
Yeah.
Right? And you compare that to women who get on the pill and they're dealing with like hormonal imbalances and disruptions, and so there's something pretty messed up in there, and I think we as guys need to be just thoughtful about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I agree, and that's why I asked it, and that was an eloquent answer without offending anyone. So let's get into the actual business aspect, right? So I mean, that was all really interesting stuff, but I'm curious, like, how do you get new customers? Like, is it word of mouth entirely? Like, do you guys use paid media? Do you have to be sensitive about what you say and don't say? Because I know there's like a lot of strict rules about that.
Yeah. Thankfully, we have not been in Facebook jail at any point, but it is a risk actually. Anytime you're dealing with human sexuality, there's always a risk of anything you do being deemed offensive.
Yeah.
So I mean, the main way we get customers is primarily we go direct to consumer, right? So you'll see our ads on Facebook, Instagram. When you're Googling at-home sperm testing, we're going to come up. We're the best option. We're the number one option.
Yeah.
We've also explored other channels that are working quite well. So we also have partnerships with fertility benefits providers that are offering fertility services to employers, right? That's an extremely effective channel for us. We are now covered by insurance in the state of New York and soon to be in the states of California and Texas. So if you are living in the state of New York, you want to test or freeze your sperm, you're paying $0 out of pocket for our product. So that's also a very effective channel for us. The fourth is one which I can't speak too much about just yet publicly, but the military channel is one that we've been investing in for a very long time.
Right.
If you think about the troops, right, they are at risk of being wounded or killed in action when they go abroad.
Wow.
They're exposed to chemicals. Men in the military are twice as likely to be infertile as the average man.
Wow.
And so we have a pretty exciting partnership we will be announcing in 6 days.
Wow.
That is really focused on the U.S. military. And we were actually recognized by the Department of Defense as a patriotic employer for hiring vets and for investing in the veteran community.
Wow, that's really awesome, and I would never have thought about that, but that's such an obvious
makes sense.
Yeah, it's such an obvious
right?
idea.
Yeah.
What is because somebody who doesn't have a medical company, right? And I want to talk about like the infrastructure setup because there's this interesting to me, right? You guys must have like at least one centralized lab everything goes to. You have
right.
teams of scientists that kind of are creating and innovating this sort of things. You have marketers. Like, could you describe like let's say or how many employees you have and what like each percentage actually does?
Yeah. So we're about 30 employees today. We've grown quite a bit. We were 7 employees last year, and so significant growth in part because we've just seen revenue growth so much. The way the company is primarily, when you're building a company that is consumer health, you have to ask yourself the question: do you start by building a consumer company first and then layer the healthcare on top? Or do you start by building a healthcare company first and then you layer the consumer on top? My belief is and always has been when you are dealing with sensitive genetic material, be it your genes or your sperm or anything that's sensitive, you need to be a trusted healthcare provider. That's why we founded the company at Harvard. That's why we've hired a team of researchers. And so even though probably 80% of our employee base is more focused on the non-medical side, we actually have a research arm to the company. So we have a head of research. We have a chief medical officer who's a urologist. We have a team of fertility specialists. We have a nurse who just joined us from Brigham and Women's, one of the leading centers, one of the leading hospitals in the United States. And those are able to do 2 things. One, help us research innovative new products. And so later this year, we're going to come out with a new type of sperm analysis that is actually novel to the industry. And the second is they're able to provide amazing customer experience to everyone who goes through our process. So we make calls complimentary. You want a telehealth call anytime, anywhere, we've got you. No fees. Talk to a specialist, talk to a doctor. And this is one of the things that we're able to do because we are a healthcare first company that then put the consumer layer on top of the health.
Yeah, and I mean, I just have so many questions. It's good, but so like for example, again, a friend of a friend founded a company called For Hims. I'm sure you've heard of it because it's like similar.
Andrew did.
Yeah, Jack and them. Yeah. So I mean, so that company, right? They sell like ED stuff. Like, have you ever thought about expanding into like similar related verticals, or is it more important for you to focus right now? Like, do you have a plan with that?
Yeah, I love this question. You're asking all the good stuff. So Roman and Hims are two companies that actually started in a very similar way, basically selling erectile dysfunction medication discreetly and kind of via telehealth appointments instead of having to go visit a doctor. And when you think about what men care about in life, men care about their ability to have sex, and men care about their ability to have kids. Right, and so companies like Roman and Hims very effectively address the former, and it's companies like us that are addressing the latter. Roman and Hims, which are now worth $5 billion and $4.5 billion respectively, have grown extremely quickly over the last few years, and we actually share in a lot of investors with Roman, who basically saw in us what they had seen in Roman at the same time. And so FirstMark Capital, which led our Series A, joined our board. That same person at FirstMark, Rick Heitzman, led the Series A of Roman and joined their board. So clearly there's a lot of kind of adjacencies between our spaces. Our goal as Legacy is to be the trusted source for all things fertility. So whether you are 20 and you know that someday you want to be a dad, someday you want to be a parent, you want to freeze your sperm with us, all the way through to you're actually trying to conceive with your partner right now and you want to have kids, to ensuring you have healthy kids with your partner, and then ultimately to helping you be a good dad to your kids. Like, that is the journey that we are very focused on. And we're also very thoughtful about, we don't want to be stepping into the territories of Roman and Hims, certainly not at this stage, because with a war chest like theirs, you have to be mindful as well at how much money they've raised.
Yeah, and so kind of what I'm hearing from that is, for now you're going to kind of focus on your keeping the main thing, but like as you expand, if you do kind of create like a war chest, you're not opposed to expanding into those horizontal verticals, because they are similar, at least related.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I think for us, we're very focused on fertility. That's where I think that we're going to be able to grow an extremely large market. It's not like we're going to be going into erectile dysfunction medication anytime soon. But certainly, I mean, you have to go where the customer takes you, right? And so I can certainly imagine us partnering with a company like Roman down the line, because of the breadth and depth of products that they're able to offer.
And so what do you like to do? Like, personally, I can tell you're like obviously a really smart guy, but it's like, because I mean, as you grow a company, you kind of have to change from like what you enjoy sometimes, or at least at the beginning, you kind of have to do everything. And then you can kind of hire people to do things that you don't necessarily do. So I'm just curious, like, what are your particular strengths and what do you enjoy doing? And then are you basically just hiring people to do everything else?
We talk a lot internally about an article that is called "Giving Away Your Legos." It's one of my favorite articles, and is by a former Facebook executive. And she joined Facebook when they were in hyper growth mode. Like, they were literally hiring too many people that she couldn't even remember anyone's names. And she writes about this concept of everyone's role at a high growth startup is changing every 3 months or 6 months. And as you're building something together, you are sometimes going to have to give away what you thought were your Legos to other people, and you're going to take other Legos. And at any high growth startup, I mean, there's plenty of Legos to go around. And so what that has meant for me is that, when I started the company a little over 3 years ago, my job was basically everything, right? I had to do everything from start to finish. And then now my role has evolved every 3 to 6 months, right? So today I actually largely delegate everything, where I have a team around me that's able to do all the work. That actually was very difficult for me. Emotionally, I had to give up. I mean, my bread and butter is the hours of 9 p.m. to 3 a.m.
Same.
That is when I have peace, solitude, and I can get work done. And I learned this years ago, and I work 2 shifts every day. I work the day shift, right, the 9 to 5, actually 11 to 6 with my team, and then I work late into the evenings, and that's how I work. It's been really tough for me to adapt to that, because now I can't do the same thing anymore. I can't just pound stuff out the way that I could when I was a 1-person, 2-person, 3-person, 5-person team. So emotionally it's difficult, but it's what you have to do. And what I am best at today is actually hiring the best people. Like, the talent density, and this is the term that Netflix kind of pioneered, and it's one that we very much, we talk about Netflix and freeze, right? You got Netflix, we're here to freeze, right? And so the talent density that we have been able to build has been phenomenal. The fact that we were incubated at Harvard has allowed us to hire folks from Harvard Law School, Harvard Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health, the Kennedy School, the college, the business school, like you name it. We have basically hired from every single Harvard school except the dental school. And beyond that, we have been able to hire. I mean, we just brought on someone from Smile Direct Club. She, when we got her to join, she was managing a team larger than my entire company. Right? You can only bring on people like that when you have a vision, and when you are surrounded by A players. Because A players hire A players, but B players hire C players. So if you don't start with people who are already at the very top of performance and ability, then your overall performance is going to go down. The average caliber of your team is going to go down. Whereas if you are hiring experts, the average caliber will go up.
So how do you find the A players though, right? Like, are you filtering just based on like the colleges they attended, like, you know, as like, but I mean, because like obviously, you know, and it was funny. I was literally just talking about this on the podcast before this, which is just funny. But it's like we were talking about how at a startup there's limited time always, right? And so like you have to use filtration methodology to at least like narrow the pool. You know what I mean? So like, what's your like methodological process for finding that talent density?
It's a great question, and certainly some of it is just convenience. I mean, the hiring that we've been able to do in Boston has been because we're in Boston. We're surrounded by great schools. We're surrounded by great hospitals. So our chief medical officer, who's a urologist, he was working at Brigham and Women's here, for example, right? And we got access to him because of serendipity in the Boston networks. You know, the way that I think about it is always, one of our internal mantras is ABP. Always be planting. I don't know if you've ever watched Glengarry, Glen Ross, and it's like always, you know, ABC, always be closing. And for us, it's always make those long-term investments that may not pay off for a year or two. I met a guy who I was introduced to by a friend in Geneva. I met him for lunch in Paris 2 years ago, and he was a specialist in male fertility. He had done years of health and life sciences consulting. He'd gone to McGill, which is also where I went to undergrad. I met with a guy and I said, Paul, I don't care how long it takes. I want to find a way for us to work together. It took me 2 years to get this guy, but I did. He's now our director of operations. The guy is unbelievable. And so you invest in people today where it might not work out for a year or 2 years, but you show goodwill, you genuinely care, you invest time, you keep them warm, and if and when the time comes and the stars align, boom.
So like, for example, and this is a selfish question because like I'm just like actually at this exact stage. Like when you like the most talented people generally demand the most competitive wages. But the problem is most startups aren't like cash rich unless you raise a significant amount of capital. So it's like beyond just like the vision and the purpose and the mission, like how are you actually like, and I'm asking very microscopically, figuring out what to pay them in compensation wise, and are you giving them equity? You know, if at all, you can kind of estimate it or whatever, but I'd be curious if you're willing to share like what common amounts of equity are at certain stages that you share.
100%, and I can feel the pain in your question because there's nothing worse than losing someone who's talented because of financial issues. So here is my philosophy, and you know, I'm a big believer that you always have to treat people like adults. So first of all, we give everyone 3 offers. One is higher on salary, lower on equity, and at the other end, it's higher on equity, lower on salary. And we say, look, these are basically equal in terms of value to the company. You tell me what you want to choose, and we'll give you that. So my general philosophy is, you want to be paying people okay to good. You don't ever want someone to join because they're a mercenary and they're going to make more money with you than they are anywhere else, because that's the kind of person who's going to up and leave when someone else offers them more money. What I do is I'm very generous with equity. And so even though at the Series A stage, it's common to give some of your hires maybe 0.1% equity, right? And what a lot of founders do, they'll say, oh, we're worth $50 million, and so that 0.1% is still worth $50,000. But the reality is it's a tiny fraction of the company. And so I have a minimum that I offer every single employee, no matter what level they're at. Every employee gets, at minimum, right now, 0.1% of the company. And that goes up higher. If you're a senior hire, you might get 0.4, 0.5%. I mean, these are pretty meaningful chunks of the company for a company that's at the Series A stage. And this does 2 things. One is it aligns incentives, right? Because when you have a real equity stake in a company, you want it to succeed. You want it to make more money and grow and be a big billion-dollar business, right? Because your incentives are aligned. And the second is it keeps people loyal to the company. Right? At a very simplistic level, when you have equity that vests over 4 years and you know that equity stake is meaningful, you're more likely to stay. And with that comes a responsibility for me to help make sure that people are able and interested and willing to grow and give away their Legos as they grow. And so one of the ways in which we do this is, again, every single person at the company, down from the, from the lowest rungs to the highest rungs, not that we're particularly hierarchical, but every single person gets an executive coach that's paid for by the company. Depending on your level, you meet with them once or twice a month. But that kind of conversation is just focused on how do you want to develop? Who's the person you want to be? What's the role that you want to step into? And how are you going to earn that equity? And how are you going to give it back to the company in spades over the next 4 years and hopefully.
And what specific company do you use to do the executive coaching? Is it like a third party, or do you hire like an internal coach that becomes that, or what?
Yeah. There's a YC company called Torch Labs that we've used in the past. Generally speaking, they're pretty good. The one advice that I have is if you are thinking about working with an executive coach, which I strongly recommend. I've had mine for more than 3 years. She's phenomenal. Don't be afraid to just find chemistry with the right person. If the first coach assigned to you doesn't feel right, swap them out, find someone who does. I went through 3 or 4 coaches in the first month until I found someone who clicked. We've been together for more than 3 years.
I love that. So two final questions for you. This is a random question, but I'm just genuinely curious, and I feel like you probably know it because every single question I've asked you, you've had like an amazing answer to. So CRISPR. I'm not going to pretend I know a ton about that, right? But I mean, I think a lot of the listeners are probably interested in editing genes, right? So I mean, like, how far along is that technology? And I don't expect you to know if maybe you don't, but I just kind of assume you probably at least have some understanding into it. Like, what is currently possible with that, and where do you think it's going?
Yeah. Ooh, very interesting question. I actually interviewed George Church, who's one of the founders of Modern Day Biology, for our own podcast, which is called Building a Legacy, about a year ago. We had a fascinating conversation about the legacy that he had built for himself, and we talked a lot about where is genome and gene sequencing going. And I'll tell you in the context of fertility, which is this. As more and more couples use IVF, either because they're not able to conceive naturally, or because they want to make sure they can have healthy kids, you have more and more of something called PGS or PGD, which is pre-genetic diagnosis or pre-genetic screening. Basically, when you take the sperm and the egg from a man and a woman and you put them together and you create an embryo, you can screen those embryos for certain types of genetic risks or disorders. And so increasingly where we are going is in this world where couples want to make sure that they are selecting the best embryo, which is a very similar logic to someone who wants to think about gene editing in order to become the best version of themselves. The challenge is a lot of attributes like intelligence are actually very polygenic. Many genes are involved. I think in intelligence it's over 70 genes. So it's not as simple as kind of snipping a wire here or snipping a wire there and boom, you have superhuman kids. With fertility, it's easier because you can screen out embryos for certain negative traits. You can say, I want to make sure that I don't have a child who's going to have a debilitating disease. And so that's where the world.
And so in the current times, right? Like if couples are listening to this and they have the ability to do so, is there anything like CRISPR wise or gene editing that people should do? Like, can you exclude the possibility of things like autism or just other like disease, kind of disabilities?
Yeah. Autism is actually a great one because you cannot currently screen for autism, and older dads and their sperm is actually very closely correlated with higher rates of autism. So by freezing your sperm when you're young and you're healthy, you're actually going to reduce the odds that your child will be born with autism down the line. That's one. Two is that you are wading into this very interesting moral territory, right? Which is, I think we're all aligned that screening embryos for negative traits is a good thing. You're helping ensure that you can have healthy kids. But at what point does the world want to move towards screening embryos for positive characteristics? Like, I want to make sure my son or daughter is tall. I want to make sure that my son or daughter has green eyes. I want to make sure they have this colored hair, right? I want to make sure they look like Kevin David as much as possible, right? Like, these are all very positive traits that you might want to screen for. The scientific community broadly is against that because you get into this concept of eugenics. Right? What does it mean to have someone who is better? Is it better is it bad to be short? Growing up as a guy who was short, I can tell you it sucks to be short. And now that I'm 5'11", I'm much happier. Right? But you wade into this very, this very
Definitely.
gray area.
Yeah, no, and that's such an interesting point, because then it becomes almost like science fiction, where you're creating like a super baby versus like a baby that the universe or God or whatever you believe intended to actually be born. So final question then for you, and this has been really interesting, by the way, one of my favorite podcasts I've done in a while. So if you could go back and speak to 18-year-old Khaled and tell him just one thing, what would you say to him?
Yeah. Come on, you know what my
Freeze your
answer is gonna
sperm.
be. It's too easy. I'm gonna go to that guy. I'm gonna look him in his beautiful eyes. And I'm gonna say, my man, freeze your sperm.
I love it, bro. So if people want to learn more about you, if you enjoy being reached out to, or if they want to learn more about Legacy, Give Legacy, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah. I mean, find us online. We're at givelegacy.com, GIVE, legacy.com. We're obviously on Instagram, Give Legacy Inc. We are on Facebook, Give Legacy. I mean, you name it, we're there. Or, if all else fails, just Google Legacy Sperm, and I guarantee you we will show up. If you want to reach out to me directly, I'm at Khaled at givelegacy.com. And, happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on, man. Seriously.